Wow, this was one heck of a week in AI. We saw the biggest financial market loss ever, where Nvidia was down 17%, all because of a new model released by a Chinese company, relatively new, called Deepseek. What is this Deepseek thing, and why did the markets freak out so much? We'll look into both of those, and if you stick around to the end, we're going to use Deepseek and put a little fun on it. It's really interesting to see how these models think. If you ever want to see an AI thinking, today's your lucky day. Let's take a look. So it all started Monday morning when we all woke up to the market losing its mind. And all of this was because Deepseek R1 had been discovered by the people who invested in Nvidia and some of the other tech manufacturers. And the prices and the efficiencies that were announced by Deepseek's information kind of freaked everybody out. As you can see here, it says the biggest market loss in history. Nvidia stock sheds nearly $600 billion as Deepseek shakes AI darling. Nvidia losing 17% of its value by close, and it was by far the greatest one-day value wipeout of any company in history. $589 billion, which is a little bit ridiculous. If you notice at the bottom of the article, the Nvidia spokesperson was quoted as saying it was an excellent AI advancement. This is interesting, while still requiring significant numbers of GPUs. All right, here you kind of get to see the cliff that Nvidia felt this week. It was a pretty rough one. It was kind of, we see a 150 high, 147 high, and 117 low, but really it has rebounded, as we'll see. So it's back up into the 120 range, that kind of neighborhood. So it is climbing back, but it really still has lost a significant amount. But the real question here is, why did the market react this way? It makes sense that the market would react if a new competitor comes into the market and it's much cheaper. And that's really what we're finding here. So in this Vox article, they talk about Deepseek is bad for Silicon Valley, but it might be great for you. AI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, and Microsoft have collectively spent billions of dollars training their models. Deepseek claims it spent less than $6 million on using the equipment to train R1's predecessors, Deepseek V3. So why exactly did the market freak out the way that it did? Investors, I think, got nervous when they heard that there was this new competitor in the market that came in at a much cheaper rate here. In this Vox article, they talk about the cost to train the models. And this is saying people that trained the largest models, these frontier models, spent collectively billions of dollars, whereas Deepseek claims that it spent less than $6 million to train its main model. That's fascinating. $6 million versus what's roughly been quoted as $100 million for something like GPT-4o or Llama or something like that. It's going to get a little nerdy for a second. Pardon the eye exam of charts, but what we're going to look at very briefly is this quality versus price. And we'll see quality is on the y-axis and price per million tokens is on the x-axis. And what's most important here is there's Deepseek up here at the top, and it is getting an 88% quality or an 89% quality, and its competitor is O1, which is getting a 90% quality. So it is incredibly close to this O1 model, and as you can tell, nothing has been close to the O1 model. Nothing has come close to its ability, but the O1 model is a thinking model. And we'll step into that in a second as we talk more about what the Deepseek system really is. But this is just an identifier that its performance, its quality, is very close to the O1 model, but its cost to use, and that's this price per token, is much cheaper, as you can tell. In fact, it's much cheaper than some of the other non-thinking models that it's clustered with. Okay, so we kind of see that the market reacted to the fact that it sounds like there's something out there doing the exact same output, giving the same quality of information for far cheaper. And we'll look into that a little bit more in a second. But really, that is a fascinating concept. It's very likely in this space that we will find efficiencies. In fact, it's required for us to move forward that we will continue to find efficiencies. The real question I think the market is asking is if Nvidia, for example, particularly because they lost so much value here, if they have invested this much into building more and more sophisticated chips, and trying to build as many as they possibly can because they're aware that they're going to have a market for as many as they can possibly build, that is under some auspices of having a certain amount of cost required to deploy this information. So if you're going to train a model, it takes a certain amount of that chip time, or CPU, or compute as we call it. So if you're going to use a certain amount of compute and you get a certain value out the other side, that equation works out in what Nvidia's been investing for. And I think the investors in Nvidia are saying, wait a second, if that's tenfold too much, then you may have overspent, and the reaction may very well be you're going to stop spending so much because you're not going to have the same customer base. That absolutely is not what it looks like is happening here, but let's take a look first into what is this DeepSeek thing anyway. First, I want to take a look at an article that came out from an interview back last year in 2024 after DeepSeek released their V2 standard model, non-thinking model, not the one that's freaking everything out right now, but the one that preceded it, or one of the ones that preceded it, is the first real model that DeepSeek announced to the world, and some of the successes and prices that they had there. That's a kind of an interesting article to see what they were thinking and how they run their company are moving forward. As you can see, this is an article from the China Academy. It's translated from July 2024 with the Deepseek founder Liang Wenfeng. And this is kind of an interesting article, kind of a broad-ranging article. I think back at this time when V2 released, the DeepSeek team had their prices set quite low, and that set off something like a price war, a price battle going on in China with some of the big providers of AI technologies there. And so some of the article is kind of focused that way. We'll cruise through this pretty quickly, but I found some of this quite meaningful. What we're seeing here is the interviewer is in blue, Liang is in yellow. This is mentioning that the V2 model triggered a fierce price war, and it asks them, were you surprised by the outcome of being a disruptor or being called a disruptor because of your price? And Liang said, we didn't expect price to be such a sensitive issue. We were simply following our own pace, calculating costs, and setting prices accordingly. Later in the article, Liang says, in disruptive tech, closed source moats are fleeting. Even OpenAI's closed source model can't prevent others from catching up. For technologists, being followed is rewarding. Open source is cultural, not just commercial. Giving back is an honor, and it attracts talent. And that's kind of important because another thing about this model, it's not what the market was worried about, but it is a very meaningful aspect of DeepSeek. They are an open source, like as far as we can tell, truly open source model. They've released their open weights. They've released all of their research around it, or largely all of their research and technology around it. And that's really very, very meaningful. The article in here, they kind of describe some of this as well. It says, what larger goal is DeepSeek betting on? Liang says, we believe that China's AI cannot remain a follower forever. He says, they think of it as there's a 1 or 2 year gap between Chinese and American AI, but the real gap is between originality and imitation. So in other words, we don't want to just try to continually catch up. We think what we need to be doing is leading. Later he's asked, do you plan to transition to a closed source model in the future? Liang says, frankly, we won't go closed source. Our challenge has never been money. It's the embargo on high-end chips. More investment doesn't necessarily result in more innovation. If that were the case, big tech companies would have monopolized all innovation. And then the interviewer asks, are you avoiding applications because DeepSeek lacks operational expertise? And Liang says something very interesting. We aim to establish an ecosystem where the industry directly uses our technologies and output. If a complete industry chain forms, there's no need for us to develop applications ourselves. So he's believing he can become a provider of intelligence rather than the provider of intelligence and some of the applications that intelligence kind of exposes. Providing cloud services isn't our main goal. Achieving AGI is. Now, I found that very interesting. He's also saying that their main purpose here is to kind of focus on AGI. It's one of the things that we've heard a lot about, but basically very sophisticated AI is what they're intimating here. And in giants, he's mentioning here are the giant model providers. Giants have users, but their cash cows also shackle them, making them ripe for disruption. And that's kind of interesting, as only 6 months later, they very seriously have disrupted. At least it's certainly starting to look like that. He later says, DeepSeek remains entirely bottom up. We also do not pre-assign roles. And in this case, he's talking about how the company is run, kind of what's the organizational structure. Is there a top-down? Are there management roles and responsibilities? Who's setting the that dictate how do different parts of their team get funding and who gets access to compute and things like that. I found this pretty interesting in this article. He says DeepSeek remains entirely bottom up. We also do not pre-assign roles. Natural division of labor emerges. Everyone brings unique experiences and ideas, and they don't need to be pushed. When they encounter challenges, they naturally pull others into the discussion. However, once an idea shows potential, we do allocate resources from the top down. And so it's very interesting, the very flat structure. Of course, they're still in the beginning, the infancy of developing their systems and their company. But it's very neat to hear. They're very open source focused, and they're very kind of flat organizationally. That's kind of fascinating to hear. But, okay, so let's get into this just for a bit. This is all a little bit of conjecture at this point, so who knows if this is real or not real, or how much it plays into some of the efficiencies that DeepSeek is reporting. It has been noted that there is belief that the DeepSeek model, this R1 model, maybe their V3 model before it, shows evidence of distillation. This is really a way of saying they started from the GPT-4o model, or data from that model, or created synthesized data out of that model in a meaningful way. That was the seed for their model. You might think of this as kind of, they started with a bare bones version of somebody else's model to start building. And that sounds okay, but GPT-4o is not open source and has very explicit rules against doing these kinds of things. So this is kind of a big allegation, and it also could very much be the clue as to why their model was so cheap to create in the first place, to do the original training. They still have a whole bunch going on here because usage prices, as far as we can tell, are very low. And we'll see this in a second, but this one's kind of meaningful from the training standpoint. If they started from not zero, they started from a starting point that somebody else had built, it could change the equation on how cheap it really was. Just worth mentioning. Once you move into the article, you'll see Sam Altman says he was impressed with DeepSeek, and it is legitimately invigorating to have a new competitor. But OpenAI representative was quoted as saying, "We're aware of and reviewing indications that DeepSeek may have inappropriately distilled our models, and we will take aggressive, proactive countermeasures to protect our technology." This is just one of those concerns that it is sort of an IP battle, and there's a bit of irony here that there's a bunch of people, artists in particular, who are looking at OpenAI in the first place saying, but isn't this the claim that we were making against you, that maybe you didn't start from zero either? The most important thing I think about this is whether or not it has any impact on the training costs that are being reported from DeepSeek and how much it costs to build their model, because that's the part that freaked everybody out. That's the part that said, does it matter that these models are far cheaper to build and run than we thought? Does that impact all of these other traditional pipelines of GPUs and CPUs and that kind of stuff? Okay, just briefly wanted to touch on what is DeepSeek. You might think of it as a normal LLM chatbot system like ChatGPT that came before it. And what we're seeing here is a comparison between GPT-01 and Deepseek R1, which are both the thinking models. But they're basically systems that you can present a query to, a prompt to of some kind, and it comes back with a result. What's unique about the DeepSeek model and, of course, the O1 model before it is that they think. So there actually is a back and forth in its pre-processing before its response. And so what we're seeing here is posing a question to the model of, tell me about yourself. It thinks for 7 seconds. So everything that's in this light gray text here is what it thought. And this is presumably multiple round trips into its own thinking processing. As you watch it, you kind of get to see this come out, and you get to see that it's moving forward on its thought, and then we'll back up and say, wait, the user might be curious about my capabilities. I should structure it this way, and those kinds of things. Wait, did I cover everything? This is very common in these thinking models. It's fascinating and fun. And in fact, at the end of this video, I'll show you using the model and what it's like to experience the thing thinking. In fact, it's thinking, it's logic processing is actually by far the best part of these models. This is covered up in GPT-01, so the OpenAI version doesn't give us insight at least this deep of insight into the thinking that is done. They do that intentionally. In this model, they've left it open so that we can see it, and it's just fascinating to watch. The general concept of how this works, nothing special here. This is just a way too high level and completely incorrect diagram, but to give you an idea that you present a prompt to the LLM, which knows it's supposed to be thoughtful about something rather than just answer, and it passes its responses on to another, presumably something like another layer, and that layer has the responsibility of saying, okay, have we thought of all of the angles here? Are there other angles to think of? Does this feel like a fully qualified answer yet? If not, let's do that same round trip again, now with what we previously thought of and a new prompt to kind of think a different direction. And in the end, when it's finally happy with it, you get the response. And so let's talk about the cost just for a second. So this is where the biggest differentiator was and what the market really had problems with. On the left, we're talking about OpenAI. On the right, we're talking about DeepSeek. So everything in blue is kind of the DeepSeek cost as much as we can, comparative costs to the OpenAI costs. So roughly estimating, we don't really know. So we can see that it was $100 million to train for OpenAI and $6 million for DeepSeek. Then there's usage per million tokens. It's easiest to say token is a word or something like that. And a million is a heck of a lot. So it's tons of books. You can think of it that way. But if you were to get a million tokens out of these, it's $50 per million from an OpenAI standpoint and $2 per million. So we're talking a 25 times difference, which is kind of incredible, of course, right? That's going to be an enormous boon. And really, this is the place that we think that what we're seeing is of great value suddenly. This is the moment that we say, wait a second, if it's $2 to use what was $50 before, applications that thought they had no possibility of putting AI into their system because it was going to be too expensive or they didn't know how to carry the cost, couldn't pass it along, those kinds of things, can now start saying, well, if it's 25 times cheaper, then yeah, I might very well be able to put these kind of features in. So that's the basic what happened, the blow by blow of what really was going on here. Basically, DeepSeek, open source model, from China and cheap, okay? Why did they attack Nvidia? Well, that's just, I think, because everybody heard that cheap part and said, okay, if it's that cheap to do, then maybe we're overspending and Nvidia is just over leveraged in all of this chip stuff and they're gonna have to back off. With Javon's paradox as our guide and these kinds of things, it's very, very likely, it's most likely that we're gonna end up using all of this new compute that we get back if this is true. If it turns out that it's actually that cheap to train these things and other systems can start using some of the techniques that this team has used, then we're going to be in a place where all of those resources are used and more. At the very least, if it's 10 times cheaper to train, then maybe we get 10 times better intelligence out the other side. But more than likely, what we end up with is far more usage and far more demand for this. So we actually probably need far more chips. This is actually just such a great thing. All right, so now let's have a little bit of fun. I don't know if any of y'all have used DeepSeek or any of these thinking models to see what they do, but DeepSeek's really the best at this because you really get to see the thinking behind it. And what we're going to do is I'm going to use 11 labs, take what Deepseek thinks, put a voice on it, bring it back in and have a little bit of fun with what it's thinking. I think what it thinks and the way it thinks is the most fascinating. The fact that it interrupts itself or it double thinks a problem or reverses back on its logic, that's really fascinating. I highly advise that you go out to DeepSeek and just issue 1 or 2 questions to this R1 version. So there's a little button in the bottom there that says Deep Think. Use that and you'll get a very interesting thread typically of how a model is thinking through the problem that you're posing to it. In this case, I'm going to pose the question. If Spider-Man and Batman had a fight, God forbid, who would win and what would the frequency of those victories be over 100 fights? Just a completely ridiculous question. And in fact, don't even worry about the answer. It's the thinking we're after, and really, it's a lot of fun. I have a couple more of these that I think I'll be making a couple other videos specifically just for this journey because some of the thinking is that interesting. Let's take a look at what DeepSeek thinks. But I'm going to pause. Do you think Spider-Man or Batman's going to win the most? I'll give you just a second to think about that because I think I was wrong. All right, so let's dive right in and see what happens when Spider-Man and Batman have a fight. All right, I've let it finish thinking, and I'm lining these things up next to one another so that you can listen to the response and follow along. I think this is a lot of fun. Let's see what Deepseek thinks about this.
Okay, so the question is, if Spider-Man and Batman had a fight, who would win? And how often would each win over 100 fights? Let's see. First, I need to think about their abilities, strengths, weaknesses, gear, and maybe their environments. Spider-Man, right? He's got superhuman strength, agility, reflexes. His spider sense warns him of danger. He can cling to walls, shoot webs, and he's really smart, like a genius in science. But he's a teenager, a young adult, so maybe less experienced in strategy compared to Batman. Batman, on the other hand, is a peak human with no superpowers. He's got martial arts skills, detective abilities, lots of gadgets, batarangs, grappling hooks, explosives, smoke pellets, etc. And his suit is armoured. He's a master strategist, plans ahead, uses fear and stealth. But he's just a human, albeit at the peak of physical and mental conditioning. So, where would they fight? The location might matter. If it's in a city like New York, Spidey's home, or Gotham, Batman's, each might have environmental advantages. Spider-Man uses the cityscape a lot with his web swinging. Batman uses darkness and stealth. In a straight-up fight without prep time, Spider-Man's physical advantages seem huge. He can lift like 10 tons, dodge bullets with his spider sense, and his webs could immobilize Batman. But Batman is used to fighting stronger opponents like Bane or Killer Croc. He uses gadgets to level the playing field. However, Spider-Man's spider sense might make it hard for Batman to land surprise attacks. If Batman has prep time, he might analyze Spider-Man's weaknesses. Spidey's reliance on webs could be countered with something that dissolves them. His spider sense can be overloaded with multiple threats. But Spider-Man is also smart. He might anticipate Batman's tactics. Without prep, Batman might not have the right gadgets. In terms of durability, Spider-Man can take more punishment. Batman's armor helps, but Spidey's been hit by much stronger villains. However, Batman's fighting skills could target pressure points or weak spots in Spider-Man's suit. Over 100 fights, if it's random encounters with no prior knowledge, Spider-Man's physical traits might give him the edge more often. But if Batman has time to prepare, he might win more. But the question doesn't specify prep time. Assuming it's random encounters in a neutral city environment, maybe Spider-Man would win 70 to 80% of the time, and Batman 20 to 30% when he can outsmart or use gadgets effectively. But I should check if there are any specific weaknesses. Spider-Man's spider sense can sometimes be tricked, like with Venom's symbiote not triggering it, but Batman doesn't have that. Batman's stealth might not work if the spider sense alerts Peter. Also, Spider-Man's web shooters can run out, but he usually carries spare cartridges. Batman's gadgets are varied but limited. Another factor, Spider-Man's humour and taunting might throw off some opponents, but Batman is disciplined. However, Spidey's agility and speed could keep him out of Batman's reach. Webbing up Batman's gadgets, like his hands, could disable him. Batman's smoke pellets might not affect Spider-Man's senses much due to spider sense. So overall, in a spontaneous fight, Spider-Man's superhuman abilities likely give him the majority. But Batman's resourcefulness could secure some wins, maybe 70-30 in favour of Spider-Man. But some might argue Batman's tactics and gadgets could make it closer. I need to weigh the factors again.
Okay, all right. So that was fun. I enjoyed that. I'm gonna have to do more of those. Those are kind of interesting. I hope this helped kind of read between the lines of what was going on with the market today and why everybody this week was talking about AI suddenly in such a meaningful way, because it dealt with the financial markets and Nvidia and Jensen being broke now. That's a little bit crazy, but I hope you have a little understanding as to why maybe some of that was happening and what it might look like going forward. As I would expect, we're going to have more and more of these kinds of discoveries come along, efficiencies and changes in the market. So hold on. I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And if you liked this video, I'm hoping to post a couple more like this. Certainly the ones about the thinking model and kind of following it along. Let me know what you think. Thanks for coming along on the ride on this one, and I'll see you in the next one.